Chapter 10. The Jaguar came power sliding out of an alley, taking the curve at more than 50 miles per hour. The hair-raising turn threw Michael against the passenger door. His right shoulder flared in agony where a crazed stranger had bitten him. Despite his own injury, Michael was more worried about the mystery woman's speared shoulder. The wound was bleeding profusely, much more than his. Years of medical training kicked in as Michael frantically attempted to apply pressure to the gash carved out by the madman's knife. To his surprise, the woman's blood felt strangely cool against his palm. "Stop the car!" he shouted. It was hard enough to try to treat a wound like this with his bare hands, let alone perform first aid in a speeding vehicle. He'd ridden in Russian ambulances that had raced through city streets slower than the Jaguar was going. "Stop the car!" The woman angrily slapped his hand away with her free hand and snatched up her pistol and aimed it at Michael. "Back off!" she ordered. Michael took the hint and did just that. He sank back down into his seat, nervously eyeing the gleaming firearm. From what he'd seen so far, he didn't think she was bluffing. Okay, he assured her, holding up his hands in a conciliatory gesture. He took a second glance back through the rear window, but there was no sign of the nut with the knife. Not that Michael much expected to see one. The Jaguar already had left the scene of the hit-and-run attack a couple of blocks behind. Michael found it hard to imagine that stranger could still come after them after being turned into roadkill. But at this point, he didn't know what to believe. The Jaguar was heading west towards the Dunabi, zipping through the cobblestone streets and intersections as if there were a Tyrannosaurus Rex on their tail. The rain pouring down outside reflected the lights of the passing street lamps and traffic signals, giving them a fuzzy red, green, or yellow aura that only made the deranged drive seem all the more unreal and dreamlike. Sheets of water poured down from the windshield, obscuring his view, but Michael glimpsed the imposing steel skeleton of the Elizabeth Bridge, named after a 19th century empress who was stabbed to death by an anarchist. His worried gaze was drawn back to the Jaguar's wounded driver. The woman's face was, if possible, even whiter than usual. She kept one hand locked on the steering wheel, while the other held the gun in Michael's face. "Look," he said, trying to reason with her. "You've lost a lot of blood." Recalling the unnatural coolness of her blood, he guessed that she had already gone into shock. "If you don't pull over, you're going to get us both killed." "Want to bet?" she said defiantly, smiling thinly through her pain. She slammed her foot down on the gas, throwing Michael back against his seat. The towering white spires of the Elizabeth Bridge loomed dead ahead, growing larger by the second. Michael had dealt with uncooperative patients before, but never like this. "I'm not screwing around," he shouted, over the roar of the Jaguar's power engine. "Neither am I," she shot back. Her gaze was glued to the road in front of them. Was it just his imagination, or were her eyelids starting to droop alarmingly? "Now shut up and hold on. I'll be fine." Michael didn't believe it for a second. He gripped the dashboard in horror as the crazed woman drove down the Satsubitsu Avenue like a maniac. Who does she think she is chasing us? He wondered. The entire Hungarian army? Once again, he recalled heavy shapes landing loudly on the roof of his apartment, followed by the roaring of inhuman beasts. The entrance of the bridge was right in front of them, and at first Michael thought she was heading over the river, but at the last minute she took a sharp turn onto the Belgrade Parkway, zooming north along the eastern shore of the Dunabi. Fashionable boutiques and department stores rapidly gave way to dockside piers and warehouses as the Jaguar rasped past the sleeping's waterfront. Towering steel cranes, silent and inactive, perched like praying mantises over dilapidated wharves, while rusty freighters bearing goods from all over Europe and beyond were anchored along the shore, waiting for dawn to disgorge a horde of freshly awakened longshoremen and stevedores. Barbed wire fences guarded wooden pallets stacked high with miscellaneous bales, crates, and bags. Where the hell is she taking me? Michael worried, peering anxiously out the windows. And do we stand a chance of getting there alive? Darkness blanketed the docks in shadows, but to the east, a faint trace of pink-coloured sky, visible only through the vertical gaps between the downtown pest's modest high-rises, sunrise was far away. Thank God, Michael thought. He couldn't wait for this ghastly night to be over, one way or another. He eyed the injured woman carefully, and was horrified to see her head shake groggily. Her eyes blinked fitfully, as if she were having trouble keeping them open. The gun in her hand shook like a Parkinson victim. I knew it, Michael realized in dismay, not at all happy to have been proven right. Before his panicked eyes, the bleeding woman passed out behind the wheel. Her head slumped forward, and the loaded automatic slipped from her fingers, landing on the black leather console between her and Michael. Out of control, the Jaguar swerved wildly. Michael grabbed desperately for the steering wheel, but the car was going too fast, and the woman's limp body got in the way. Tires squealed on the slippery asphalt as the Jag veered to the left, crossing two lines of traffic to careen madly towards the docks. Frozen in fear, Michael couldn't look away from the windshield. He watched helplessly, his heart pounding like a snare drum, as the Jaguar plowed through the metal guard rail, throwing off a fiery orange spark. The Jag bounced down a rocky embankment, its state-of-the-art computers, shock absorbers doing little to relieve the bone-jarring jolts that tossed Michael up and down from side to side. He brutalized his shoulder, shrieked in agony, joining the high-pitched scream tearing its way out of Michael's lungs. The front end of the Jag hit a jagged block of concrete, and the plummeting car tumbled over and towards the river below. Michael felt as if he were being beaten to a pulp inside a blender. "This is it," he gasped in a moment of staggering clarity. "I'm going to die." And he didn't even know why. Then the Jaguar was airborne, and for an instant, an eerie silence replaced an ear-pounding screeching and crashes. Michael heard his own heart racing, and listened to the breathless pants issuing from his lips. Curiously, he heard nothing at all from the unconscious woman. He couldn't even tell if she was breathing. Through the front window he saw a moonlit surface of the Dunabi rush towards them like a tidal wave. The Jaguar crashed nose first into the river, with a tremendous splash. Michael's overtaxed seatbelt came loose, and his head rammed into the windshield like a cannonball, cracking the glass. Seeing stars, he struggled to remain conscious despite the ringing in his skull. If he passed out now, he would never wake up. Already the floating Jaguar was slipping beneath the surface of the river. Michael realized he was only minutes away from drowning. Rippling darkness swallowed them whole as the car sank towards the bottom of the Dunabi, its spinning tires churning up a blurry of bubbles and debris. Though the spiderweb were the cracks across the windshield, Michael could see only opaque green shadows. He frantically tried to open the passenger door, but discovered that the mysterious abductor had locked it in electronically, probably to keep him from bailing out of the Jaguar the minute it slowed below 50. He shot an aggrieved glance at the unconscious woman, then spotted her handgun lying on the center console. A crazy idea occurred to him, and he snatched up the gun and fired it at the window. The sharp report of the gun echoed painfully inside the cramped confines of the sinking Jaguar. Glass shattered, and a cascade of freezing water rushed in, soaking Michael to the skin and splashing against his face. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with much of oxygen as he could manage in preparation for a death-defying swim to the surface. Maybe there was still a chance to get out of this alive. He looked across the flooding compartment at the helpless woman, still dead to the world. She made no effort to save herself, even as the cold dark water engulfed her. Michael hesitated, torn between self-preservation and surprisingly powerful urge to rescue the endangered woman. She had done nothing but threaten and kidnap him. Yet Michael found himself horrified at the possibility of her dying before he even found out her name. What the hell? He dropped the gun, letting it sink to the floor, and grabbed the woman beneath her arms. Dimly remembered lifeguard training, forgotten unused since the summer he had worked at Coney Island, came back to him as he propelled them both through the shattered window into the murky depths of the river itself. He kicked strenuously towards the surface, trying to ignore the bone-numbing chill of the water. October was no time to go swimming in the Dunabi. The insensate woman was dead weight in his arms, as limp and lifeless as a sack of potatoes. He held her tightly beneath her armpits, his hands locked together beneath her breasts. Her loose brown hair caressed his face, the dark tresses drifting in the current like seaweed. Moonlight penetrating the watery darkness called to Michael like a beacon, letting him know which way was up. Gravity dragged at his heels as he climbed towards the shimmering silver light with agonizing slowness. His lungs burned, yearning for air, and had to bite down hard to keep from inhaling the river itself. He could swim, faster, he knew with his arms freed, yet he held on tightly to his beautiful burden. His meagre supply of oxygen was all but exhausted when his head and shoulders finally broke through the surface of the river. Choking and sputtering, he gulped down heaping lungfuls of fresh air as he bobbed upon the waves. Only a few inches away from his face, the woman's head slumped limply to one side, and he took care to keep her mouth and nose above the water. Her lovely features were cold and white as polished bone. Blood darkened the shallow waves lapping at her wounded shoulder. "Who are you?" he wondered, shifting position so that he kept one arm around the woman's slender waist, whilst freeing up the other arm to swim with. And why is you so important to me? Fighting the current, which rapidly carried them away from the site of the Jag's final resting place, Michael side-stroked towards the shore. Night still shrouded the dock in shadow, despite the rosy promise of dawn. Feebly, he called out for help, but exhaustion sapped the carrying power of his voice, and after swallowing several mouthfuls of brackish water, he abandoned the effort, concentrating instead making it to the eastern bank of the river. His pathetic cries didn't even rouse the woman in his arms. Michael worried about hypothermia, uncertain if the dark-haired stranger was still alive. I'm going to feel really stupid, he thought, if I drown trying to rescue a dead woman. It seemed to take an eternity to reach the shore. Michael's shivering body felt numb from the neck down by the time he crawled onto the muddy slope beneath a rotting wooden dock. Moss and slime coated the weathered rocks, protruding from the embankment, making it hard to get a grip as he dragged himself and his uncomplaining companion into the damp, claustrophobic space. The slick green underside of the pier was only inches above his soggy scalp, providing them with precious little headroom in which to maneuver them. Garbage washed up along the shore, littering the filthy riverside burrow. Michael felt a curious kinship with the broken bowls, crumpled beer cans, cigarette wrappers, greasy rags, and other assorted bits of flotsam cast up onto the uncertain embankment. Like them, he had no idea or why he ended up soaked and dishevelled beneath the docks. At least I'm still alive, he thought. That's something. Breathing hard, he gave himself a moment to recover from the grueling swim. He wanted to put his head down and sleep for a year or two, but knew he couldn't collapse entirely until he had seen to the woman. For all he knew, she required immediate medical attention. Water gurgled from her mouth as she laid down on her side, ways atop muddy rocks. He caught a glimpse of pearl-white teeth, oddly pointed incisors. Her eyes were closed, hiding the striking brown orbs he remembered from the subway station. He gently raised her eyelids to check her pupils, which were widely dilated. He felt a thready pulse at her throat. Michael guessed that she was suffering from shock, hypothermia, blood loss, or all of the above. Not to mention a close brush with drowning. In a way, it seemed a miracle that she was alive at all. Her wound, he noted, had finally stopped bleeding. Thank heaven for small favours, he thought. There was no time to lose. His teeth chattering like castanets, he rolled her onto her back, then clasped his hands together and pressed down sharply on the woman's abdomen. Once, twice, 3 times. Come on, he urged her, silently. Water streamed from his hair and whiskers, raining down on the patient's leather-clad form. His eyes scoured her face to see some sort of sign that she was responding to this urgent ministrations. Breathe for me, breathe. He refused to give up on her. You can't do this to me, he thought. He recalled the defiant glint in her eyes as she pulled the gun on him, remembered the cold smile on her porcelain face as she fearlessly raced the Jaguar through city streets, snatching away from the nut in the lobby and whatever was prowling out on the rooftop. For the first time, it dawned on him that she might very well have saved his life, although he couldn't begin to guess why. You can't die, he protested vehemently, staring in anguish at her lifeless, lovely features. Even unconscious and streaked with mud, she was still the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. I don't even know who you are. She gagged suddenly, frigid water gushing from her mouth and nose, and his heart leaped in relief. She coughed and sputtered, lifting her head a few inches above the sludge. Her eyes flickered open just long enough to look up and see Michael's kneeling over her. He tried to flash her a reassuring smile, employing his best bedside or dockside manner. His medical training came to his rescue again. And he tugged open her shirt to check on the extent of her injuries. It was possible, after all, that she might have been hurt in the crash, on top of the knife wound in her shoulder. Her skin beneath the waterlogged black fabric was as smooth and white as ivory. He reached down to probe her ribcage gently, only to succumb to a sudden wave of dizziness that sent his head spinning. His vision blurred, and the darkness encroached on his periphery of his sight. He shook his head groggily, trying and failing to overcome the sense of lightheadedness washing over him. He touched his forehead and winced in pain. He tugged back bloody fingers. Shit, he thought, remembering his head-on collision with the windshield. I have a concussion.